The road into Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse runs straight and flat through Norman farmland. And on the night of June 8th into the 9th, 1944, it was one of the most dangerous strips of ground in France. Somewhere in the darkness to the south, the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment had spent the daylight hours pressing the Regina Rifle Regiment back from the ground it had won coming off Juno Beach. The Reginas had absorbed that pressure and held their line, but their company commanders were not done. They reorganized in the dark and kept moving. The Reginas sent a fighting patrol south that night, not because conditions were ideal, but because a company commander had looked at the ground and decided that darkness was the opportunity rather than the obstacle. Colonel Kurt Meyer, the regiment's German commander, had been briefed on the Canadians. He had adjusted his initial contempt upward after watching them come off the beach on June 6th. What the briefing had not told him, and what no German briefing had told any German commander in the Western Theater in any form that altered defensive planning, was that the Canadians did not stop fighting when the sun went down. They accelerated. Meyer would spend the rest of the Normandy campaign learning this at growing cost, without ever receiving from the intelligence system above him a satisfactory explanation of why it kept happening. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. The question of why it kept happening is what this account addresses. It is not a story about bravery, which both sides possessed in quantities that 80 years of distance makes it almost impossible to adequately measure. It is the record of a specific operational capability that the Canadian Army built over 5 years of fighting in 2 theaters, and that German commanders at every level, from the most dismissive to the most carefully prepared, could never account for in a way that translated into effective defense. Every formation that faced Canadian troops wrote about the night attacks in their after-action reports. The reports grew in detail and in respect from the first assessments filed in Sicily in the summer of 1943 to the final Rhineland summaries submitted as the 1st Parachute Army was pressed back across the Rhine in the early weeks of 1945. The reports named what the Canadians did, what they could never name, because intelligence reports cannot name the interior of a capability, was why they did it with a steadiness that made darkness a weapon in their hands rather than a difficulty to be managed. The doctrine that governed European warfare in 1940 rested on a principle military professionals on every side understood with the conviction of a physical law. Night belongs to the defender. The logic was not caution. It was professional judgment derived from the specific conditions of industrial-age warfare and from the particular lessons of the First World War. Darkness dissolves the coordination that an assault requires. In the 1940s, radio communications were not reliable enough, and the procedures for using them not refined enough to maintain command and control over formed infantry moving across unfamiliar ground in conditions where no man could see more than a few yards in any direction. Units lost each other. Friendly fire multiplied because the gunners supporting the attack could not observe their fire and could not identify the forward edge of their own troops. The attacking force was at a fundamental disadvantage against a defender who had spent the day preparing the ground, registering machine guns, plotting mortar tables, laying wire where it would be felt before it was seen. Night attacks happened in the Second World War on every front. They were not unknown as a tactic. What they were not was the preferred method, the first choice of a formation that had options. The preferred choice was the deliberate daylight assault following artillery preparation, with observation that could watch the whole engagement and correct the fire as it developed. This was the professional consensus of every major army in the war, grounded in real combat experience. What it missed was a specific kind of soldier for whom the proposition did not apply in the way it applied to everyone else. The Canadian Army that assembled in Britain between 1940 and 1943 was, by any conventional military standard, an unusual organization. Its permanent force before the war had been minuscule, so small and so poorly funded that it constituted less a professional army than a skeleton upon which a wartime force would be draped. The officers commanding the expanding formations were a mixture of those few regulars, militia officers who had maintained their commissions through 2 decades of peacetime indifference, and civilians handed ranks because they were educated, persuasive, or simply present. The soldiers were volunteers, almost without exception. Canada had no conscription for overseas service until 1944, and the men who went first had made a choice. They had decided, individually, without compulsion, to cross an ocean and fight a war. That quality of agency shaped the kind of soldiers they were in ways that no training program could replicate in a conscript force. What those men brought from their lives before the Army mattered in the specific context of night operations in ways that are difficult to fully quantify, but impossible to ignore in the record of what they produced. The country they came from was, in 1940, primarily a country of farms and forests and coasts rather than cities. The men who enlisted first and fastest were often the ones from small towns and rural townships who had grown up in a relationship with darkness that the urban world does not share. A Saskatchewan wheat farmer who rose before 4 in the morning every day of the growing season, who worked his fields before light and after it, who knew his ground by the feel of the soil under his feet rather than by anything he could see. A British Columbia logger working old-growth timber stands in coast weather, in the particular gray half-darkness of old forest where direct sunlight never reached the floor, moving around heavy equipment and unstable ground by sound and feel and memory. A Nova Scotia fisherman who had worked tidal channels since childhood, reading the water at night by the sound of current against rock and the smell of particular tides off specific headlands, navigating in fog since before he was old enough to be called a man. A Northern Ontario trapper who spent weeks at a time in bush country where the nearest road was a day's walk, who moved at first light and last light, and sometimes in full dark because the animals he trapped set their own schedule, and a man who only worked in daylight did not make a living. These men were not comfortable in darkness because someone had trained them to be. They were comfortable in darkness because that was the condition of the work they had been doing all their lives before the Army found them. You learn to suppress the noise a frightened man makes in darkness, the involuntary haste, the heavy footfall, the caught breath that announces a human presence to every listening ear within 100 yards. You learn because the work required it, and you could not afford to fail at the work. The training in Britain added military structure to this foundation. Infantry battle drill, in full darkness, conducted on ground the soldiers had not seen in daylight, requiring navigation by compass bearing and pace count without visual reference. Fire and movement practiced at night until the sequence became reflex rather than thought, executable without seeing the cover or the section or the ground between them. The Canadian battalions, sitting in England from 1940 to 1943, had more uninterrupted training time than almost any Allied formation in the war. They were not being taught a skill they had no basis for. They were being given a structure for something many of them already understood at the level of the body. Sicily in July 1943 was the first large-scale test. The terrain imposed the problem directly. Hillside villages fortified over centuries, positioned to command every approach, defended by men who had prepared their positions across months of occupation. The standard Allied response was the set-piece assault with preliminary artillery. Canadian company and platoon commanders looked at the same hillsides, at the same artillery schedules, at the men they would lose walking uphill in daylight and to prepare machine gun fire, and began moving at midnight instead. Not from any directive issued above them. From the judgment of lieutenants and captains who had been trained for 3 years and were now applying that training to the problems the ground presented. The war diaries of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry from the Sicilian Campaign record night operations with a frequency that does not appear in the records of the British formations operating on adjacent axes during the same weeks. The difference accumulated, across weeks of operations, into a pattern. The German formations defending those Sicilian positions noticed before any intelligence summary had named it. The after-action reports of the Hermann Göring Division contain language about Canadian night operations that would be repeated, with increasing specificity and urgency, in every German report on this force across the following 2 years. The word that appears most consistently, translated from the German staff officers' bureaucratic precision, means unpredictable. What the reporting officers meant was this: the Canadians did not observe the operational rhythm that all other Allied formations observed to greater or lesser degree. They did not stop when the light failed. That observation entered the German intelligence file on the 1st Canadian Division and traveled with it into Italy when the division crossed the Strait of Messina in September 1943. The Italian peninsula deepened the problem. The rivers that crossed every line of advance at right angles were natural defensive barriers of exceptional strength, and the German engineers who prepared each river line had months to do the work. The Moro River crossing in December 1943 opened the road to Ortona. The German after-action report on the engagement contains a detail that the official history does not foreground. The Canadians had coordinated their artillery and infantry in darkness at a standard of proficiency that German defensive planning had not anticipated. The guns lifted on the prearranged timing, and the infantry moved through the gap with enough accuracy that the defenders had no time to reoccupy positions the shells had temporarily suppressed. The report noted this as a capability requiring adjustment in future defensive preparation. What it translated to in the field was that the method Canadian units had been practicing in Britain for 3 years was producing results in combat that the defenders had not been told to expect. Ortona in December 1943 compressed the lesson into 7 days of fighting in a medieval port town on the Adriatic coast. The standard accounts of the battle focus on the mouse-holing technique, the loyal Edmontons, and the Seaforths blasting gaps through interior walls to advance from building to building without entering the streets that the German 1st Parachute Division had turned into killing grounds. What those accounts treat as secondary is what happened after dark. The German paratroopers defending Ortona were among the most experienced combat soldiers in any army in the war. They had fought in Crete, in North Africa, in Sicily. They had been briefed. They knew the Canadians were aggressive. They expected the Canadians to fight for the town by day and consolidate by night. On December 21st, the second day of the fighting for the town, a company commander of the Seaforth Highlanders concluded that the position his men occupied was not defensible until a German-held building directly across a narrow alley, which could fire into his rooms, was taken. He assembled 12 men. He moved at 2 in the morning. The German platoon inside the building was not asleep and not unarmed, but it had stood down from its fighting positions in the expectation that no attack was coming until dawn. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. 11 Germans surrendered. 3 Canadians were killed. The building was in Canadian hands before first light. The Seaforth's war diary records the action in 4 lines. The German 1st Parachute Division's after-action report is considerably longer. Its essential conclusion is 1 sentence in length. This enemy will attack at any hour, and planning that assumes the night provides time for reorganization is planning that this enemy will exploit. That warning moved through the Italian theater intelligence system, but did not arrive in Normandy in sufficiently specific and operationally actionable form to alter the defensive preparations of the 12th SS Panzer Division before June 6, 1944. The institutional gap between the Italian theater and the Northwest European theater was real. Reports crossed between them slowly, filtered through command structures consumed by the logistics of the greatest amphibious operation in history. Meyer had revised his contempt upward after watching the Canadians on Juno Beach. He had not been given the specific knowledge, in a form that changed his regimental orders, that his infantry would be attacked in the dark by men who moved through darkness with a steadiness his soldiers could not match. The Regina Rifles patrol on June 8 found what Canadian soldiers consistently found in the first weeks of the Normandy campaign, that the German positions had been configured for the daylight battle and had not been reconfigured for the night. The sentries were alert and the wire was in place, but the machine guns were oriented toward the approaches registered in daylight. The mortar crews had stood down, and the reserve sections had been released to rest in the expectation that the next fight would begin at dawn. The Carpiquet airfield battles in early July demonstrate the mechanism with the clarity of sustained engagement over multiple days. The assault on July 4th took the village and the north side of the airfield, but stalled against the fortified hangars and control buildings on the southern perimeter. Standard professional response was to consolidate, prepare a detailed fire plan, and renew the assault at dawn with fresh support. What happened across the night of July 4th into the 5th was a sequence of Canadian company and platoon actions that the operational history records as minor and that the 12th SS War Diary describes as continuous enemy pressure through the night hours. 3 separate Canadian units moved against German-held positions after dark. The ground they took was limited. The cost to the German defense was not. Mortar ammunition was consumed responding to attacks that did not produce decisive penetration. Positions were shifted, in some cases temporarily abandoned and reoccupied, as Canadian movement created threats that could not be precisely located in the dark. German soldiers who should have been resting in reserve positions were recalled forward to respond to threats that dissolved before they arrived and materialized elsewhere. When the prepared Canadian assault went forward on July 5th, it moved through a defense that had not slept, had expended a proportion of its ready stocks, and had spent the night in the reactive posture that makes a decisive response to a determined daytime assault nearly impossible to organize. The German casualty returns for those 48 hours reveal, in their specific distribution between the night of the 4th and the day of the 5th, that the darkness cost the German defense as much as the subsequent daylight, and cost it in a way that was harder to absorb and replace. Operation Totalize in the first hours of August 8, 1944, was the moment the Canadian command scaled the individual and company-level habit into something operating at the level of an army. General Guy Simons had watched what his infantry had been doing at night since Sicily and asked what it would look like with armored columns. The design was audacious. Armored formations advancing in darkness, guided by radio navigation beacons and searchlights angled to illuminate the flanks without silhouetting the vehicles. Multiple columns on parallel axes timed to cross the start line simultaneously and move through the first defensive belt before the German gun positions could coordinate a response. The risks were real. Armor in darkness loses the visual observation that daytime movement depends on. Columns drift. Units lose each other. The whole advance can arrive at dawn in a position that bears no resemblance to the plan. Simons accepted those risks because he had watched the method work at the lower level for 14 months and believed the men could execute it. The German formations defending the corridor south of Caen had been briefed on Canadian night operations in general terms. What they had not been given was a doctrinal framework for responding to a coordinated armored advance in complete darkness at formation scale, because no such framework existed. The first signal that Totalize had begun was the sound of tank engines at a distance that left no time to man positions prepared for an assault from the north in daylight. The first defensive belt fell in less than 2 hours. The German accounts from the Totalize sector described the particular disorientation of defenders who knew the Canadians attacked at night and who had still not been prepared for what it meant when an army made that knowledge its operational method at every level simultaneously. The Scheldt estuary provided the hardest test. Major General Kurt Meyer had read the Normandy reports and the Italian intelligence. He built his defense in the Breskens pocket on the explicit assumption that the Canadians would come at night, and that the defense must be prepared accordingly. He flooded the polders to channel movement onto the raised dike roads. He registered his mortars on every section of those roads. He maintained alert postures through the night with a discipline that the Normandy formations had not managed, and he told his battalion commanders that the Canadians would attack at night, and that this expectation should govern every detail of the defensive preparation. On the sectors where the Wasp flamethrowers preceded the assault on October 6th, the crossing succeeded with limited resistance. On the sectors where the flame could not reach the deeply positioned defenders, the canal was a killing ground, and the Canadians paid a severe price. Meyer had done what the briefing told him to do, and had worked partially for the first hours. What Meyer could not solve was the 3 weeks that followed, a defense that must maintain full alertness at all hours indefinitely exhaust the soldiers who hold it. Meyer's plan required him to predict the likely attack windows with enough accuracy to concentrate his alertness and allow some rest at other times. The intelligence told him the Canadians preferred midnight and the hours before first light. He prepared for those windows. The Canadian attacks came inside those windows sometimes and outside them at others in a pattern that, from a German side, appeared entirely without structure. From the Canadian side, it was not random. It was the product of dozens of individual companies and platoons attacking when their own preparations were complete, when ammunition had been brought forward, when the supporting fires were arranged, when a local reconnaissance had given the platoon commander what he needed to move with confidence. That readiness varied by sector and by day in ways that no German intelligence officer could track. Meyer, captured on November 2nd, told his interrogators that the Canadian method had made it impossible to manage the defensive rhythm his plan required. He had prepared for night attacks. What he had not been able to prepare for it was an enemy whose attacks were governed by the enemy's own readiness rather than by any schedule the defense could identify. Alfred Schlemm commanded the 1st Parachute Army in the Rhineland battles of February and March 1945, with the most complete intelligence file on the Canadian Army that any German commander had possessed during the war. The file was thorough and substantially accurate. It named the artillery coordination system. It described the refusal to break under counterattack. It identified Canadian night operations as a defining operational characteristic, supported by specific examples from Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the Scheldt. Schlemm had read it. He had briefed his commanders from it. He prepared the Reichswald and the Hochwald with 3 belts of fortification and the flooding of the approach routes and the positioning of his army's most experienced troops at every likely axis. He was, by the standard of everything the German army knew about preparing a defense against the Canadian formations he was facing, as well prepared as a German commander was going to get. Operation Veritable began on February 8th with a bombardment from over 1,400 guns firing simultaneously. The Canadian and British divisions of the 21st Army Group crossed the German frontier and entered the Reichswald forest. Nothing the Canadians had faced in Normandy or the Scheldt had prepared the individual soldier for what the Reichswald presented. The forest was dense enough that tanks could barely move between the trees. The ground was a swamp. The Germans had been preparing this terrain for months, with trenches and minefields and barbed wire and pre-registered artillery, and behind the forest itself the Hochwald, a second belt of fortifications manned by Schlemm's best troops. Fallschirmjäger with unit pride and experienced NCOs and orders to hold every meter of German soil. They had been told that the Rhine was the last line. They believed it. The Regiment de la Chaudière, a French-Canadian battalion of the 3rd Division, infiltrated through a gap in the Hochwald defensive line in the early hours of February 26th. A company moved through a weakness between 2 German battalion positions that the Chaudière's own reconnaissance had identified the previous day. 800 yards in darkness through mixed forest. They arrived behind a German strongpoint that had held against frontal Canadian assault for 48 hours. The strongpoint faced encirclement or withdrawal. It withdrew. 2 days of prepared assault, of ground measured in hundreds of yards per day, and 12 men moving in the dark had produced in 6 hours what the formed assault could not force in 2 days. The German operational report recorded the withdrawal as tactically sound given the new tactical situation. What it did not record was how the new tactical situation had come to exist. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The Regina Rifles, the same regiment that had bled at the Leopold Canal 4 months earlier, were ordered to clear a strip of dense forest near Muschow that the Germans had turned into a strongpoint complex. Bravo Company went in with Wasp flamethrowers on February 18th and gained 200 yards inside the wood in the first minutes. 200 yards in the Reichswald measured against the general rate of advance was a significant gain. The Fallschirmjäger counterattacked from the right flank with a ferocity that stopped the advance cold. The fighting in Muschow would continue for 5 more days. But what the regimental record shows across those 5 days is the same pattern that the German reports had been describing since Sicily. The Canadians did not pause when the light failed. They pressed through the nights, probing for the flanks of the German positions, pushing small groups through gaps in the line, forcing the defenders to respond to threats that materialized in the dark and dissolved before dawn, costing the defense men and ammunition and the rest that experienced soldiers need to fight at full capacity. Between the fall of Ortona in late December 1943 and the breakout from the Hitler Line in May 1944, the 1st Canadian Corps fought its way up the Leary Valley in a series of actions that refined the night fighting method at the brigade and divisional level. The Gari River crossing on the night of May 11th into the 12th was the most ambitious night water crossing the Canadians had yet attempted at Corps scale. 4 brigades crossed in the dark on a broad front, each with its own artillery fire plan, its own engineer support for the bridging, and its own infantry assaulting the far bank in the period between the lifting barrage and the first light that would reveal the bridgehead to German counterattack. The crossing succeeded at serious cost, but it succeeded in the dark, and what it demonstrated to the officers who planned and executed, it was the upper limit of what night operations could achieve when the coordination extended from the individual platoon through every echelon to the guns of the Corps artillery. That understanding moved with those officers when they rotated through the command structure, and several of the brigade and battalion commanders who had fought the Gari crossing arrived in northwest Europe in time for the Scheldt and the Rhineland, with their understanding of large-scale night operations already tested in combat rather than merely theorized. The German formations they faced in those later battles were encountering the product of a learning curve that had been built across 5 years in 2 theaters, and that was represented in the men across the wire from them. Not as doctrine they had been taught, but as experience they had lived. The specific technical evolution of Canadian night fighting methods across the war is traceable in the after-action reports that battalion and brigade intelligence officers filed after each major operation. The early reports from Sicily acknowledge improvisation. The reports from the Italian campaign show refinement. The Normandy reports show a method sufficiently standardized that brigade commanders could plan around it with confidence. The Scheldt and Rhineland reports show a method so integrated into how the Canadian Army fought that its absence would have required a fundamental reorganization of how formations approached the assault. The fire support coordination, the communication procedures, the patrol methods, the approach march drills, all of it had been tested enough times against a competent and determined enemy to have the rough edges worn off and the effective elements reinforced by survival. The men who came home in the autumn of 1945 carried the finished version of something that had been built from scratch on the hillsides of Sicily 2 years earlier, and they had built it in the most demanding laboratory available, in contact with an enemy who had every incentive to find its weaknesses and who never stopped trying to do so. The mechanism by which Canadian night operations worked is worth examining at the level of the individual soldier and the individual night, because the aggregate statistics, ground taken, prisoners collected, after-action reports filed, can make the whole enterprise seem cleaner and more predictable than it was. It was not clean. It was cold and dark and frightening and slow, and the men who did it understood that their lives depended on a silence so complete that even the click of a rifle bolt against a web strap could end everything. The technique, insofar as it had been refined into something teachable, began with sound. A Canadian infantry section, moving toward a German position at night, navigated first by the noise of the position itself. German soldiers, like soldiers of every army, generated sound in the dark. The cough suppressed imperfectly in the cold. The low exchange between 2 sentries at a wire. The metallic scrape of a weapon shifted against a sandbag. These sounds, inaudible in daylight over the noise of vehicles and artillery and moving men, became precise locators in the dark. A veteran platoon sergeant could read a German position from its sounds the way a harbor pilot reads a channel. He knew from the density of the coughing approximately how many men were in a trench. He knew from the direction of the voices where the listening posts were placed. He knew from the absence of sound where the gaps in the wire were most likely to be, because the gaps were where the sentries did not need to stand. This was not exotic. It was learned. It was the product of moving through the dark enough times to understand what darkness revealed rather than what it concealed. The fire support that enabled Canadian night assaults was the product of 3 years of developing exactly the coordination that the German reports consistently singled out for particular note. The technical problem was real and remained real throughout the war. A gun line firing at night cannot observe its own shells. The forward observation officer directing the fire is in the dark with the infantry and cannot see the burst in the same way he can in daylight. The answer the Canadian artillery and infantry had worked out over years of training and months of combat was procedural rather than technical. The precise registration of final protective lines and support positions in daylight, the establishment of known bearing and range to every target in the likely area of operations, and the prearrangement of lifting times that the infantry could depend on and advance through without the communication that darkness made unreliable. The forward observation officer, lying in the dark beside the platoon commander, was not watching the shells fall. He was watching his watch and counting the lifts against a prearranged schedule, adjusting when the infantry's radio told him they were moving faster or slower than planned, firing illumination at specific moments to let the advancing sections orient themselves on the objectives they had studied on the ground models back in the assembly area. The system was not perfect. Friendly fire happened. Troops advanced into their own barrage on nights when the timing was misjudged or the ground was slower than expected. But it worked well enough, consistently enough, that the German reports noted it as a distinctive Canadian capability rather than an occasional lucky performance. The coordination was systemic. It was the product of an army that had trained for it long enough that the procedures were part of how these men thought about fire support rather than a specialist application they reached for in specific circumstances. The Italian campaign had shaped the night fighting method in one further specific way that the German reports on the Northwest European campaign consistently noted without fully explaining. The Canadians who landed in Normandy in June 1944 were not the same soldiers who had gone to Sicily in July 1943. 11 months of fighting in Italy had produced, in the 1st Canadian Infantry Division and the 1st Canadian Corps that grew around it, a corps of junior leaders, platoon commanders, company commanders, battalion intelligence officers, whose understanding of how to use darkness was experiential rather than theoretical. They had done it. They had moved at night against prepared positions across the Sicilian hillsides, across the Moro and the Sangro and the Arieli rivers, through the streets of Ortona, and they had learned, through iteration and through the particular education that comes from watching what happens when you get it wrong, how to make it work. That corps of experienced junior leaders was the single most important thing the Canadian Army brought to Normandy that the intelligence file never adequately described, because the intelligence file could name the tactics, but not the competence behind them. A German after-action report could note that the Canadians coordinated at night. It could not note that the men doing the coordinating had been doing it in contact with the enemy for 11 months and had developed a quality of operational judgment that was not available to formations facing the Canadians for the first time. The distinction between the Canadian-Scottish Regiment's performance on the right flank of the Leopold Canal crossing and the Royal Montreal Regiment's disaster on the left flank illustrates this directly. Both units were attacking on the same morning, against the same prepared German defense, in the same darkness and the same weather. The Canadian-Scottish had fought from Juno Beach. The Royal Montreal Regiment had been serving as headquarters defense troops and had not previously been in a sustained infantry battle. The Canadian-Scottish crossed and established their foothold with losses that the operational histories describe as acceptable. The Royal Montrealers were nearly destroyed at the water's edge. The difference was not courage, which both units possessed, and it was not equipment, which was identical. It was the specific competence that 11 months of fighting in Italy and then 4 months of fighting in Normandy had built in the Canadian-Scottish, the knowledge of how to read a defended crossing, how to use the dark, how to keep moving when the men beside you were falling, how to judge whether the fire coming at you was oriented specifically at your position or was general defensive fire that could be advanced through. That knowledge could not be briefed into the Royal Montrealers before the assault. It could only be acquired the way the Canadian-Scottish had acquired it, at a cost that no amount of headquarters protection had been asked to pay. The regimental histories of the Canadian formations that fought from Sicily to the Rhine contain, in their cumulative detail, a portrait of how the night fighting capability was maintained and transmitted across the turnover of men that any sustained combat force undergoes. The Regina Rifles, to take one battalion whose record runs from Juno Beach to the Rhineland, suffered casualties of the Leopold Canal that amounted to nearly 4 rifle companies' worth of men in a single month. The men who replaced those casualties were not raw recruits in any formal sense. They had been through basic training and the reinforcement pool, but they had not fought at night in contact with an enemy that was specifically prepared for them. The way the Reginas maintained their effectiveness across that turnover was through the junior leaders who survived, the corporals and sergeants and subalterns who had been in Normandy from the start, and who carried in their own practice the specific knowledge of how the battalion operated in the dark. These men did not teach through formal instruction. They taught through example, by taking the new men on patrols and letting them watch what a man who knew what he was doing looked like when he moved at night in the dark 200 yards from a German position. The knowledge passed from experienced soldier to replacement soldier through proximity and observation in a way that no training depot could replicate. The German after-action reports noted the consistency of Canadian performance across changes in the battalion's composition and never fully accounted for how that consistency was maintained through the losses. The answer was in the informal transmission of expertise from a men who had learned it to the men who were learning it now, unit by unit, patrol by patrol, in the dark. The villages of the Rhineland in March 1945 were the final setting in which the full weight of what the Canadian Army had built over 5 years came to bear on the German defense. The operations around Xanten and Kalkar and the approaches to Wesel brought together the flamethrowers and the night fighting methods and the artillery coordination and the particular quality of men who had been building these capabilities since Sicily. The 1st Parachute Army was fighting for the last kilometers of German soil west of the Rhine. The Fallschirmjäger in the villages and the farms and the fortified houses were elite soldiers with elite unit pride, men who had been told by their officers and believed in their bones that what happened on the west bank of the Rhine would determine whether there was anything left to defend on the east bank. They fought with a ferocity that the Canadian operational histories acknowledge without qualification. But they were also men who had been fighting continuously since Normandy, in some cases since the beginning of the war in the West, and who had been told by every intelligence briefing they had received that the Canadians would attack at any hour. The telling had not adequately prepared them for the fact of it. There is a difference between knowing that an enemy attacks at night and lying awake in a cellar in the dark in a fortified building in Germany in March 1945 listening for the engine sound of a carrier that might or might not come in the next 30 seconds. The knowing is analytical. The lying awake is something else. It is what the Canadian method produced in the men who faced it. Not just the attacks themselves, but the continuous anticipation of attacks, the inability to identify the safe hour, the exhaustion that accumulated from nights of waiting for something that came sometimes and sometimes did not, that arrived from the expected direction sometimes and from somewhere else entirely at other times. This was the real product of the capability the Canadian Army had built, not the ground taken, which could be measured. The exhaustion of the defense, which could not be measured, but which appeared in the end in the rate at which positions that should have held broke faster than the casualty figures alone could explain. Maurice Meyer was a corporal with the Chaudières in March 1945. He had enlisted in Quebec City in 1942 at 19 years of age and had come ashore on Juno Beach on June 6, 1944. He had fought through every major engagement of the Northwest European campaign. In the battalion's after-action records, he was asked whether night attacks were harder than daylight attacks. He said that in daylight you could see what was trying to kill you, which was frightening, but in darkness you could not see anything at all, which was also frightening. And the difference was that the Germans were frightened by the dark as well, and in his experience the Canadians were less bothered by it than the Germans were. Asked why he thought that was, Meyer said he thought it was because most of them came from the country. And in the country you learned early that darkness was not something to be afraid of. It was just dark. You moved in it the way you moved in rain. Not comfortably, but without the particular paralysis that comes over a man who has never learned to function without seeing. That answer is not doctrine. It appears in no training manual the Canadian Army produced during the war. It is a corporal's reflection offered in a field debriefing, and it is more accurate than most of the operational analysis that followed. The German Army's difficulty with Canadian night fighting was not a failure of intelligence or planning in the ordinary sense. By 1945, the German file was thorough, current, and substantially correct in every particular it named. It described the artillery methods. It described the tactical habits. It identified night attacks as a defining characteristic of the Canadian operational style and traced that characteristic through 5 years of fighting in 2 theaters. What the file could not contain was the interior quality that made the method work when the coordination was imperfect and the ground was unknown and the men on the other side were waiting. That quality was not manufactured by training. It was brought by the men from the country they came from. The gap between what the German intelligence file said about Canadian soldiers and what the German soldier actually encountered when the Canadians came at night was not a gap that any briefing could have closed. Briefings work through language. They describe behavior. They cite statistics, they note patterns. What they cannot transmit is the feeling of a thing. The German soldiers who had read the assessments of Canadian night operations, who had been told by their officers that the Canadians preferred the hours of darkness and would use them, were not wrong to think they understood the situation. They had the information. What they discovered, when the information became experience, was that knowing a thing and encountering it are separated by a distance that cannot be covered by any amount of advanced preparation. A sentry who had been briefed that the Canadians attack at night and who heard movement in the dark 60 yards from his post was in a situation that his briefing could describe but could not equip him for. The quality of that moment, the stillness required, the decision required, the particular combination of trained reflex and individual judgment that the moment demanded, was something that had been built in the man across the wire through years of doing it, and it was not available to the man on the other side of the wire through any mechanism other than doing it himself. The Canadians had been doing it since Sicily. The defenders of the Rhineland had been briefed on the fact of it. The distance between those two positions is the distance this entire story has been measuring. The war in the Canadian sector ended on May 5, 1945. The regiments came home across the summer and autumn. The men went back to the wheat farms and the timber stands and the fishing coasts. The operational knowledge they carried, how to cross open ground in darkness, how to maintain the coordination that gives the pressure its effect, how to press an advantage at 3 in the morning without losing the cohesion that makes the advantage real, went with them into private life and dispersed there. It had never been in the manuals. It could not be preserved in manuals because the manuals were not where it lived. The German record on Canadian night attacks spans 5 years and 2 theaters, and it is, in its aggregate, a document of professional respect that grew from initial dismissal through careful accounting to something approaching genuine bewilderment. Every formation that faced the Canadians wrote something about the night operations. The reports named the effects. They named what the Canadians did, and they cataloged the ground it cost, and the soldiers it took, and the positions that had been held at nightfall and were gone at dawn. What none of them found, across 5 years of writing and revising and passing the file forward, was a way to describe the cause with enough accuracy to build a defense against it. They described the method. The men behind the method remained, in the intelligence files of the German army, an explanation the files could not provide. They were standing in the dark somewhere in Normandy or Belgium or the Rhineland, and they were not particularly bothered by the dark. They were just moving through it, the way they had been moving through it all their lives, toward the next German position, in the particular steadiness of men who had chosen to be there and who understood, without needing to be told, that the night was not the enemy. It was just the condition of the next thing that had to be done. The Canadian Corps that formed in Britain in 1940 was not built to produce night fighters. No order was issued to that effect. No doctrine mandated it. It happened because of who the men were, and because the war gave them the time and the territory and the enemy to develop what they had brought with them into something that an army could use. The German intelligence file on the Canadian Army was, by the end, more detailed and more accurate about this specific capability than about almost any other tactical characteristic it documented. It named the method. It described the effects. It acknowledged the capability, with a particular respect, that professional soldiers accord to a thing they have been beaten by enough times to understand they are not going to stop. What the file never found, because the file was made of language and language has limits, was the word for what it actually was. It was soldiers from a big empty country moving through the dark the way they had always moved through the dark, toward the next thing that needed to be done. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.